Welcome to the Food Startups Podcast, where we connect the opaque world of food startups. Hello, and welcome to episode number 46. It's early. I just had my morning glass of water mixed with a little bit of sodium bicarbonate, also known as baking soda. I'm doing that because I'm trying to regulate my pH and become more alkaline. We have a nutrition show coming up, and I'm bringing an expert on, but I've been touching up on basic chemistry and nutrition. I want to go over all the foods that I use in my diet and that are recommended, because for me, it's all about preventive medicine. And I'm traveling quite a bit these days, so I've kind of accepted that when you're traveling, unless you want to not eat at all, sometimes it's really tough to eat healthy. So I go for a B-, C+ when I'm traveling, and then when I'm back in Bogota, an A+ type diet. Now, today, it's kind of ironic that I'm talking about nutrition and I'm bringing on the story of McDonald's. But I encourage you guys to listen to a very, very, very interesting account of bringing the franchise McDonald's to the country of Colombia. I live here now, and there's still a huge stigma from friends back home in the US and Europe. Oh, but isn't Colombia so dangerous? Well, truth be told, it's not. I've never had anything happen to me in the last 5 years. But the story that we're going to talk about is from the 90s. And in the mid-90s, Colombia was incredibly dangerous. In 96, Clinton slapped economic sanctions on Colombia, concluding that the Colombian authorities had not fully cooperated with the U.S. war on drugs. The drug cartels had so much power in the mid-90s and early 90s, and it was considered by the U.S. foreign policy like North Korea or Syria or Iran today or Afghanistan. It was really, really bad. And to bring a franchise that is an incredible, incredible system. It is one of the best systems I've ever studied. It's quite the feat. So without any more wait, I'm going to bring on Pedro Medina. Pedro, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Now, my first question for you is, what made you want to bring McDonald's to Colombia?
I was studying in the University of Virginia, and I met a person called Jim Bradshaw, who was a president of the alumni committee for the college, and he became a mentor to me. I was selling books door to door during the summers, and this guy had sold books before, so I invited him to a meeting to help me recruit people to sell books, and he did a fantastic job, and he became a mentor. And one day he asked me, "What do you want to be doing when you're 35?" I had no idea. But the fact that he asked me prompted me to pinch myself in the butt. And I went up to the Blue Ridge Mountains with a jug of water, a pad of paper, and a pen. And I told myself, I won't come down till I have written dreams for myself. So I forced myself to write my dreams down. At that time, I wrote down that I wanted to get married at 32 and have kids at 35. Got married at 28. And 2 months later, we were pregnant. Now I have 3 wonderful kids. The other dream was that at age 35, I wanted to be running a company where I could have direct contact with the public and where I could be a positive influence on a lot of people. At age 34, I convinced McDonald's to make me their joint venture partner for Colombia.
How do you think they said, all right, Pedro Medina, we're going to let you run this joint venture for Colombia? Because I'm sure tons of people asked for that opportunity.
Well, I chased them for 2 years. I'm convinced that had a big role in the whole process. After this opportunity was the brothers of 2 former Colombian presidents. A ton of people were after the opportunity. And I'm convinced that really what made me different was that I was persistent. I was pleasantly persistent, and that was key. It was 6 months before I could get the first phone call, before I could get a person, a McDonald's executive, to come to the phone to answer my call. And I called 16 times before I could get that to happen. So I think a lot of times people just give in before they should. And I think so many times people are evaluating you on the other side of they're seeing how much desire does this person have. If they just make a couple of phone calls and that's all the desire they have, then maybe the opportunity is not for them. On the other hand, if the burning desire is there, and if that burning desire translates into action, into persistence, then that makes a big difference.
Great answer, Pedro. So persistence, persistent, but with a pleasant kind of overtone. And if I have this right, in South America, Colombia was one of the last countries to receive or to have McDonald's open their branches there. Why was that?
Well, really, in the whole Western Hemisphere, Colombia was one of the last really interesting countries from a demographic, a social, and economic point of view. It was one of the last treasures, one of the last nuggets. McDonald's tried to open in Colombia back in the early 80s, and they chose a partner then, and the partner gave up. And then after that, for some reason, the opportunities were very difficult to come about here in Colombia. The legislation changed. There were difficulties with laws about repatriating royalties. And then Colombia became a dangerous country. That's 1982 was the Minister of Justice was killed. Then things became very difficult. So at that moment, McDonald's, I think, went to countries where things were not so challenging.
I've read about McDonald's today. A lot of people have a negative impression of McDonald's because of the quality or lack there of their food. But, it's an incredible company and one of maybe the best example of a successful franchise. And I've read about them enough to know that like consistency, cleanliness, all these things are very, very important. A very, very detailed system, I would say. So I wanted to ask you, bringing and opening this first franchise in Colombia, what were some of the biggest challenges of adapting that system here in Colombia?
There are probably three big challenges. One was in training the people. I think McDonald's has a clear system, has clear procedures, and oftentimes Colombians have a difficult time following procedures. We have a difficult time following instructions. So people wanted to find a better way to do it, but oftentimes the better way was maybe not so better, So that was a challenge initially to train the people. I think a second challenge was we opened the first restaurant in 1995, and that's when, at the end of 1995, the whole trust and confidence crisis started as Colombia became decertified by the U.S. government. We were placed in the category of 7 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea, Libya. Our president at that time, President Samper, was taken off, was found by the U.S. government to have received drug money for his campaign, and he was denied a U.S. visa. And the whole confidence crisis that emerged out of this, we, being McDonald's at that time, very visible U.S. company, obviously had an effect in the business. There was terrorism. McDonald's fortunately didn't suffer that terrorism because of an initiative that we started few years later, which was called Yo Creo en Colombia, which we'll talk about that later. But there was a challenge, a big challenge in sales. We did not have breakfast in those days. People were not going out at night because they were afraid. It was a very difficult time in our history, so people were not going out at night. So we were all dependent on lunch business, which was very, very difficult. So I think the second challenge was a positioning and a sales challenge. And I would say probably the third challenge was we grew too fast. We opened 10 restaurants in the first 12 months, and the learning curve is very difficult. Learning and having people learn at the rate that you need when you're growing so fast, that's a big challenge.
Wow, so you opened 10 restaurants in 12 months, so you scrambled to get everything into place to get these open. Do you have any stories of, I'm sure you do, because for the listeners who don't know about Pedro Medina, he is a great storyteller. Do you have any stories of, getting paperwork or getting tax docs in order that came down to the wire when you were trying to open your first McDonald's?
There were issues with construction permits. That was difficult. So we ended up opening a lot of food court restaurants or restaurants inside shopping centers, which is not the ideal situation because you're depending on the marketing of the shopping center, which sometimes can be great and sometimes can be really, really lousy. You're dependent on a positioning within a shopping center, or sometimes they don't let you do things. Maybe we knew marketing techniques, we knew marketing strategies, but sometimes we just were not allowed to execute them because nobody else had done it. So it was very, very difficult to operate within the shopping centers. We opened 10 restaurants, we ended up closing 5, which were mistakes. So We did the fastest opening of McDonald's anywhere in the world, but then we realized we fell flat on our face. We had really, really screwed up in terms of some of those decisions. About to open the first restaurant, March of 1995. I was flying to Caracas that day to train some of the people that we had in training there. And because of stress in the plane, I had an aneurysm. And I had to get my head open and get operated. And I still have a scar here to prove this. And when we were opening the third restaurant, the marketing manager had a heart attack. We were opening our fifth restaurant. The HR manager came into my office and just crying and said, I cannot take this. He quit. He was very, very capable. So I think hindsight is 2020. I think we went too fast. I don't know why we're in such a hurry, but we went too fast. The first restaurant we opened, there was a huge line a month outside the restaurant, a line of more than 1 block for people wanting to come in. So we really pushed the accelerator and we opened those 10 restaurants. But in hindsight, I would have gone a lot slower. I think we burned a lot of people. I think we did a lot of damage on people because we just went too fast. We went too fast and we were burning people. It was very difficult. I almost died, because of bad management of stress.
I've talked to a lot of our listeners, and sometimes they talk about the stress, and it's really nothing on your level like opening McDonald's in Colombia, but even just distribution locally in the U.S. to stores and having to wear every hat because you can't afford to pay someone to do this. You have to learn how to do it yourself. So I think that's a warning for everyone to think about that. You can lose your life. Now, Pedro, one last question about McDonald's. Behind the Arches, which is by John Love, and probably one of my favorite business books. He just did an amazing job. McDonald's is known more as a real estate business, and I think it's basically due to charging rent on a basis of sales. Now, did you guys have the same model in Colombia?
What I had with McDonald's was a joint venture partnership, and we started to franchise out of the joint venture partnership. So we did have that model. And there is some truth behind that. I think McDonald's doesn't see its business as a real estate business, but clearly there is a real estate business behind this whole thing. I think it would be more clear real estate business if the places were bought with the idea of selling them, which some have been around the world, but McDonald's sits on very, very, very valuable property around the world. That's part of the net worth, obviously, of the company. But those places, most of them were not bought with the idea of being sold. They were bought with the idea of being used. What we had here, we had about 50% of the lots were purchased, 50% of the lots were rented. We did long-term leases, 20-year leases. And when we had a franchisee, we charged a rent to a franchisee. And there was a business there, obviously.
Now, did they have to go attend McDonald's University in the U.S. in order to have a franchise here?
Yes. Either in the U.S. or in Brazil. Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for coming on today. And the reason I know you is through your foundation, Yo Creo en Colombia. I believe in Colombia, and you've helped me out a lot. And I'd like you to tell listeners what you're doing with your time today.
When people ask me where I'm from, I say Colombia. And then I ask them, when you think about Colombia, what do you think about? And clearly, there are some good things that come out. Some people talk about the coffee or the emeralds or the two oceans or the flowers or Montoya or Shakira or Juanes or Garcia Marquez. But many people still think of Colombia with the negative stereotypes. And that was the first reflection on this project of Yo Creo en Colombia. I felt that I wanted to change the mind of outsiders about Colombia. But then I realized that really what we need to do is we need to change our own mind about our own place. I was in a classroom in 1999 with 39 students, and I asked them, how many of you see yourselves in Colombia in 5 years? 12 raised their hands, and I turned to the other 27 and said, how about yourselves? And they said, tell us why we should stay in Colombia. I said, well, the coffee and the emeralds and the two oceans and the flowers, and I couldn't think of anything else. And a professor without arguments is no good. So I felt frustrated. I put together a research project, 18 months in 5 universities, and we put together a talk called ¿Por qué creer en Colombia? Why one should believe in Colombia. I started giving this talk back in 2001. And in the first 8 months, running McDonald's in 3 boards with 3 kids, I gave that talk 256 times. Some days I would do it 5 and 6 times a day. And it became so big, I decided to leave the corporate world, and we put together a nonprofit. I went for a year to Harvard as a fellow, And we put a nonprofit called Yo Creo en Colombia, I Believe in Colombia. And our vision in 10 years is to have a project of I Believe in, Yo Creo in every single one of the 35 countries and territories in Latin America. And basically, we research what works. It's asset-based development versus problem-based development. We research what works and we put together contents, powerful contents, talks, workshops, TV programs, radio programs, through which we achieve 3 objectives. The first one is collective self-esteem, how we see ourselves. The second one is social capital, how we relate to each other. And the third one is marketing, how we tell our story. So everything I learned selling hamburgers, I now use selling Colombia and selling Latin America. To whom? To our own people.
Great. Well, guys, all of these things that Pedro's talked about, and I'll link to some of his speeches, will be up on the website. And Pedro, where can we find you on Twitter?
It's YCC Pedro, Pedro, YCC as in Yo Creo Colombia, YCC Pedro.
Great. Thank you so much, Pedro.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, find us online at foodstartupspodcast.com.